The October wind cut through the mesquite trees like a blade, carrying with it the smell of dust and dying grass. Sarah McClintock pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she guided her mule toward the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Texas. The wooden crates tied to the animal's back rattled with each step, cornmeal, dried beans, and salt pork that would see her through another harsh winter alone. The trading had gone well. 3 Comanche braves had met her at the old cottonwood grove, just as they had twice before, when desperation drove her to seek their help. Unlike the white merchants in town who demanded prices she couldn't afford, the Comanche had been fair. Blankets and winter supplies in exchange for her late husband's rifle and ammunition she couldn't use anyway. "Fair trade," the eldest had said in broken English, his weathered face serious but not unkind. "You good woman, not like others." Sarah had nodded, understanding more than she dared admit. She'd seen how the townspeople looked at any Indian who dared approach Cedar Falls, with fear, hatred, and disgust. But these men had shown her more respect in their brief encounters than most of her own neighbors had in 2 years of widowhood. The sun was beginning to set as she reached the edge of town, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. She urged the mule forward, hoping to reach her small cabin before full darkness fell. The streets of Cedar Falls were mostly empty, save for a few men gathered outside Murphy's saloon and the warm glow spilling from windows where families sat down to supper. "Sarah McClintock!" The voice cracked like a whip through the evening air. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the commanding tone of Reverend Carmichael. She turned to see the tall, gaunt preacher striding toward her, his black coat billowing behind him like the wings of a carrion bird. Deputy Tom Brennan flanked him, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Reverend Carmichael," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Good evening." "Is it?" The Reverend's grey eyes were cold as winter steel. "I've heard some very disturbing reports about your activities today, Mrs. McClintock." Sarah's mouth went dry. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't compound your sin with lies." Carmichael stepped closer, and Sarah caught the smell of whiskey on his breath beneath the facade of righteousness. "You were seen meeting with savages at the old grove, trading with them like they were civilized human beings instead of the godless heathens they are." "I needed supplies for winter," Sarah said, lifting her chin. "I can't afford the prices in town." "So you consorting with the enemies of Christian civilization?" Carmichael's voice rose, attracting the attention of passers-by. "These are the same devils who murdered your husband, woman. Have you no shame? No loyalty to your own kind?" Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the mule's reins. "The Comanche who killed James were raiders from the northern bands. These men are peaceful." "There are no peaceful savages," Carmichael thundered. "They are all children of Satan, and you have betrayed every decent Christian in this town by treating with them." More people were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. Sarah saw Mrs. Henderson from the general store, old Pete from the livery stable, and several other faces she recognized from Sunday services. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to disgust, but she saw no sympathy in any of them. "I've done nothing wrong," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing wrong?" Carmichael laughed, a harsh sound that made her skin crawl. "You've traded with our enemies, given them aid and comfort. You've brought shame upon this entire community with your wanton behavior." "Wanton behavior?" Sarah's temper flared. "I'm trying to survive the winter, Reverend, nothing more." "Survival?" Carmichael's eyes glittered with a dangerous light. "A proper Christian woman would trust in the Lord's providence, not bargain with devils. But then, perhaps your moral failings run deeper than we thought." The crowd murmured at his words, and Sarah felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. She knew what he was implying, that her independence, her refusal to remarry quickly or place herself under the protection of a male relative, somehow made her morally suspect. "I am a God-fearing woman," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "I attend services every Sunday. I pay my tithe." "You live alone without proper supervision," Carmichael interrupted. "You reject the guidance of your betters. You trade with savages, and now you stand before us, defending your shameful actions instead of begging forgiveness. Seems to me," Deputy Brennan spoke up for the first time, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who enjoyed his authority, "that Mrs. McClintock here has been making some mighty poor choices. Makes a man wonder what other arrangements she might have with them Indians." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Several women in the crowd gasped, and she saw the gleam of vicious satisfaction in their eyes. This was what they had been waiting for, a chance to tear down someone who had dared to live differently, to survive without conforming to their rigid expectations. "How dare you?" Sarah breathed, her face flushing with shame and rage. "The truth always hurts, doesn't it?" Carmichael said, his voice dripping with false compassion. "But the Lord sees all, Mrs. McClintock. He sees your sins, your betrayals, your corruptions, and through his servant, he will ensure that justice is done." "What are you talking about?" Sarah's voice rose in panic as she saw the crowd beginning to close in around her. "I'm talking about purging this community of your corrupting influence," Carmichael said, his eyes blazing with fanatic fervor. "I'm talking about justice. I'm talking about making an example that will ensure no other woman in this town ever forgets her place or her duty to Christian civilization." The wind picked up, howling through the street like a banshee's cry. Sarah's mule shifted nervously, sensing the tension in the air. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, people she had known for years, people she had sat beside in church, people who had once offered their condolences after James's death. Now they looked at her like she was something unclean, something dangerous that needed to be eliminated. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I've done nothing wrong. I was just trying to survive." But she could see in their eyes that it was already too late. The decision had been made. The judgment passed. All that remained was to carry out the sentence. Reverend Carmichael smiled, and Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Dawn broke grey and cold over Cedar Falls, bringing with it an atmosphere thick with anticipation and malice. Sarah McClintock had spent the night in the town's makeshift jail, a converted storage room behind the general store, listening to the sounds of voices gathering outside. Through the small barred window, she could see people arriving from the surrounding homesteads, their faces grim with purpose. Deputy Brennan had given her a tin cup of lukewarm coffee and a piece of stale bread, more out of obligation than kindness. "Big day today, Mrs. McClintock," he'd said with a smirk. "Reverend's called for a town meeting. Gonna settle this matter once and for all." Sarah's hands shook as she sipped the bitter coffee. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with fear and disbelief. In the space of one evening, her life had transformed from difficult but manageable to a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The door creaked open, and Mary Jenkins slipped inside, her round face creased with worry. Mary was one of the few women in town who had shown Sarah any kindness since James's death, perhaps because she understood the struggles of widowhood herself. "Sarah, dear," Mary whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "I brought you this." She pressed a small bundle wrapped in cloth into Sarah's hands. "Some biscuits and a bit of ham. You need to keep your strength up." "Thank you, Mary," Sarah said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "What's happening out there?" Mary's face darkened. "The Reverend's been preaching since before sunrise. Got folks all worked up about Indian troubles and other things. He's saying you're a threat to the whole community." "A threat?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "I'm one woman trying to survive the winter. How am I a threat to anyone?" "It's not about what you did, Sarah," Mary said quietly. "It's about what you represent. A woman living alone, making her own decisions, not asking permission from any man. That scares them more than any Indian raid ever could." Before Sarah could respond, the door burst open. Deputy Brennan stood in the doorway, his expression stern. "Time to go, Mrs. McClintock. The Reverend's ready for you." Mary squeezed Sarah's hand. "I'll be praying for you," she whispered. Sarah was led through the streets of Cedar Falls like a criminal. The entire population of the town and surrounding area seemed to have gathered in the open space in front of the church. Men, women, and children lined the walkways, their faces a mixture of curiosity, righteous anger, and cruel anticipation. Reverend Carmichael stood on the church steps, his black coat making him look like a dark angel of judgment. His voice carried clearly across the crowd as he spoke about the corruption that threatened their Christian community. "Behold," he announced, as Sarah was brought before him, "the woman who would sell us all to the savages for a few trinkets and provisions. The woman who has forgotten her place, her duty, her very soul." The crowd murmured its approval, and Sarah felt their hatred washing over her like a physical force. She searched the faces for any sign of sympathy or doubt, but found only the glazed eyes of mob mentality. "Sarah McClintock," Carmichael continued, his voice rising to a theatrical pitch, "you stand accused of consorting with the enemies of civilization, of betraying your own kind, and of bringing shame upon this God-fearing community. How do you answer these charges?" Sarah lifted her chin, summoning what remained of her courage. I answer that I have committed no crime. I traded fairly with peaceful men who showed me more courtesy than my own neighbors have. A gasp rippled through the crowd at her defiance. Someone shouted, "Shameless!" and others took up the cry. "Peaceful men!" Carmichael laughed harshly. "These are the same demons who have murdered countless innocent Christians across this territory. The same godless heathens who scalped women and children not 50 miles from here just last month." "Those were different bands," Sarah began, but Carmichael cut her off. "There are no different bands of Satan's children," he roared. "They are all the same, murderers, thieves, and corrupters of Christian virtue. And you, woman, you have aided and abetted them in their evil work." Old Pete from the livery stable stepped forward, his weathered face twisted with anger. "I say she's been doing more than just trading with them Indians," he called out. "A woman living alone entertaining savages makes a man wonder what other unholy activities she's been up to." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers and knowing looks. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame and rage. "That's a lie," she cried. "I've done nothing but try to survive." "Survive?" Carmichael's eyes glittered with fanatic fervor. "Or thrive on the wages of sin? Tell us, Mrs. McClintock, what other services did you provide to your Indian friends?" The implication was clear, and Sarah recoiled as if she'd been struck. "You're a man of God," she said, her voice shaking. "How can you stand there and speak such filth?" "I speak the truth that burns in the hearts of all righteous people," Carmichael declared. "You have betrayed everything decent and holy. You have brought corruption into our midst, and now you stand before us unrepentant, defending your shameful actions." Mrs. Henderson from the general store pushed forward, her pinched face flushed with righteous indignation. "My own daughter asked me why Mrs. McClintock lives alone without a man to guide her. What was I supposed to tell her? That it's acceptable for a woman to reject God's natural order? She's a bad influence on all our women," another voice called out, "teaching them that they don't need to mind their husbands and betters." The crowd was growing more agitated by the moment, their voices rising in a cacophony of condemnation. Sarah could see the situation spiraling beyond reason, beyond hope of redemption. "What would you have me do?" she cried out desperately. "I've harmed no one. I've broken no law. I've simply tried to make an honest living and survive in this harsh land." "Honest living?" Carmichael's voice dripped with contempt. "There is nothing honest about a woman who abandons her proper place in God's creation. Nothing honest about consorting with savages. Nothing honest about corrupting the moral fiber of our community with your willful disobedience." Deputy Brennan stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "The way I see it, Reverend, we got ourselves a real problem here. This woman's been giving aid and comfort to our enemies. In wartime, that's called treason." "Treason," Carmichael repeated, savoring the word. "Yes, that's exactly what it is. Treason against civilization itself. Treason against the natural order that God himself established." The crowd roared its approval, and Sarah felt the last of her hope dying. She looked around desperately, searching for any face that might show mercy, any voice that might speak in her defense. "Mary," she called out, spotting her friend in the crowd. "Mary, tell them you know me. Tell them I'm not what they say I am." Mary Jenkins stood frozen, her face pale with fear. For a moment Sarah thought she might speak up, might risk the crowd's wrath to defend her. But then Mary's eyes dropped to the ground, and she stepped back into the safety of the mob. "It seems," Carmichael said with satisfaction, "that even your so-called friends cannot defend your actions. The verdict is clear, Mrs. McClintock. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting." "What verdict?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Carmichael's smile was cold as winter. "The verdict of a community that will not tolerate corruption in its midst. The verdict of righteous people who understand that some sins are too great to be forgiven, too dangerous to be ignored." The wind picked up swirling dust devils through the assembled crowd. Sarah shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but she knew that no amount of cloth could protect her from the chill that was settling into her bones. "Tomorrow," Carmichael announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, "we will cleanse our community of this corruption. We will ensure that no other woman ever forgets her place, her duty, or the price of betraying her own kind." As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the morning's events, Sarah was led back to her makeshift cell, but she could feel their eyes following her, could hear their whispered conversations about justice and punishment, and the terrible fate that awaited those who dared to step outside the narrow bounds of their rigid world. The door slammed shut behind her, and Sarah sank to her knees on the cold wooden floor, finally allowing the tears to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Falls Cemetery as the townspeople gathered for what Reverend Carmichael called the final cleansing. Sarah McClintock stood between Deputy Brennan and two other men, her hands bound behind her back with rough hemp rope that cut into her wrists. She had not slept at all during the night, listening to the sounds of digging and hammering that echoed through the pre-dawn darkness. Now she understood what those sounds had meant. A wooden box, crude but sturdy, lay open beside a freshly dug grave. The reality of what they intended hit her like a physical blow, and her knees nearly buckled. "Steady now," Brennan muttered, his grip tightening on her arm. "Don't want you falling down before the ceremony's properly begun." Sarah's mouth was dry as dust, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. Around her, the entire population of Cedar Falls and the surrounding homesteads had gathered. Men, women, and children stood in a loose circle around the grave, their faces ranging from eager anticipation to sick fascination. Some of the women had brought picnic baskets, as if this were a church social instead of an execution. Reverend Carmichael stood at the head of the grave, his black Bible clutched in his hands like a weapon. His grey eyes blazed with the fervour of a man who believed himself to be God's chosen instrument. "Citizens of Cedar Falls," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery. "We gather here today to witness the purification of our community. For too long we have tolerated corruption in our midst. We have allowed the poison of moral decay to spread unchecked, but no more." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah saw faces she recognized, people who had once nodded politely to her at church, who had bought eggs from her small flock of chickens, who had offered brief condolences after James's death. Now they looked at her with cold satisfaction, as if she were a rabid animal about to be put down. "Sarah McClintock," Carmichael continued, turning his burning gaze upon her, "you have been judged by this community and found guilty of the most heinous crimes against Christian civilization. You have consorted with savages, betrayed your own kind, and brought shame upon every God-fearing family in this territory." "I've done nothing wrong," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Nothing wrong?" Carmichael's voice rose to a thunderous pitch. "You have rejected the sacred order that God himself established. You have lived as a harlot, entertaining heathens while good Christian women tend to their proper duties. You have corrupted the moral fibre of our community with your willful disobedience." Old Pete stepped forward, his weathered face twisted with righteous anger. "She's been carrying on with them savages," he declared. "Living alone, entertaining men in her cabin at all hours. What decent woman would do such things?" "That's a lie," Sarah cried out, finding her voice at last. "I've done nothing but try to survive. I've hurt no one, broken no law." "You've broken God's law," Carmichael roared. "You've violated the natural order that places women under the guidance and protection of men. You've chosen to live as a creature of Satan rather than a daughter of Christ." Mrs. Henderson pushed forward, her pinched face flushed with excitement. "My daughter asked me why some women think they can live without husbands to guide them. What was I supposed to tell her? That it's acceptable to reject God's plan?" "She's teaching our women to be rebellious," another voice called out. "To think they don't need to mind their husbands and betters." The crowd was working itself into a frenzy, their voices rising in a cacophony of condemnation. Sarah could see the madness in their eyes, the terrible satisfaction they took in her suffering. This wasn't about justice, it was about fear. Fear of change, fear of independence, fear of anyone who dared to live differently. "What would you have me do?" Sarah cried desperately. "Starve? Freeze? Beg in the streets?" "You should have remarried," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "Placed yourself under proper male authority. Instead, you chose to live in sin, entertaining savages and corrupting our children with your shameful example." "The judgment has been passed," Carmichael declared, raising his Bible high above his head. "The sentence must be carried out. Sarah McClintock, you are hereby condemned to be buried alive, that your corruption might be cleansed from this earth, and your soul might find whatever redemption awaits it in the hereafter." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah felt her legs give way, and only Brennan's grip on her arm kept her from falling to her knees. The wooden box seemed to grow larger before her eyes, its dark interior yawning like the mouth of hell itself. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I have family in Missouri. Send me away, banish me, I'll never come back, I swear it." "Banishment is not enough," Carmichael said coldly. "Your corruption runs too deep, your example too dangerous. Only death can cleanse the stain you've left upon our community." Mary Jenkins stood at the edge of the crowd, her face pale with horror. For a moment, Sarah thought she might speak up, might find the courage to challenge this madness. But then Mary's husband placed a firm hand on her shoulder, and she looked away, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Into the box," Brennan commanded, pushing Sarah forward. Sarah resisted, her feet sliding in the dirt. "No, please, this is murder. You can't do this." "Hold her steady," Carmichael ordered. Strong hands seized Sarah's arms and legs, lifting her bodily toward the wooden coffin. She struggled wildly, screaming for mercy, for justice, for any shred of human compassion. But the crowd only cheered louder, their voices drowning out her pleas. They forced her down into the box, her bound hands making it impossible to brace herself. The rough wood scraped against her back as she was pushed into the narrow confines. The smell of fresh pine and grave dirt filled her nostrils, and she could see nothing but a narrow rectangle of grey sky above her. "Any last words?" Carmichael asked, his voice dripping with false compassion. Sarah looked up at the faces surrounding her grave, faces that had once been familiar, even friendly. Now they were the faces of strangers, twisted by fear and hatred into something barely human. "God will judge you for this," she whispered, "all of you, and when he does, you'll find that his justice is not the same as yours." Carmichael's face darkened with rage. "Blasphemy to the very end," he snarled. "Close it up." The wooden lid came down with a sound like thunder, plunging Sarah into absolute darkness. She heard the scrape of nails being hammered into place, each blow echoing through the confined space like a death knell. Then came the sound she had been dreading, the hollow thud of dirt hitting wood. "Let this be a lesson to all who would corrupt our community." Carmichael's voice came muffled through the earth. "Let it be known that Cedar Falls will not tolerate those who reject God's natural order. We are a righteous people, and we will remain pure." The crowd began to disperse, their voices fading as they returned to their homes and their daily lives. Sarah could hear children laughing, women discussing plans for Sunday dinner, men talking about the weather and their crops. Life was going on as if nothing had happened, as if a human being had not just been buried alive for the crime of refusing to conform. The dirt continued to fall, each shovelful sealing her fate more completely. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she thought of James, of the life they had built together, of the dreams that had died with him on a lonely stretch of prairie 2 years ago. Above her, the sounds of the world grew fainter and fainter, until all she could hear was the beating of her own heart and the whisper of her own breath in the suffocating darkness. The air was growing thin, and she could feel panic clawing at her chest like a living thing. But even in her terror, Sarah held on to one thought. Somewhere out there, beyond the narrow-minded hatred of Cedar Falls, there had to be someone who understood the difference between justice and revenge. Someone who would not let this evil act go unpunished. The last thing she heard before unconsciousness claimed her was the sound of the wind blowing across the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of sage and freedom, and perhaps, just perhaps, the distant drumbeat of hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth. Running Wolf crouched motionless in the shadow of a weathered boulder, his dark eyes studying the settlement of Cedar Falls spread out below him in the valley. The Comanche warrior had been watching the white town for 3 days now, troubled by the unusual activity he'd observed. Too many people gathering, too much excited talk, too many meaningful glances cast toward the cemetery on the hill. Something was wrong. The very air seemed to carry the stench of injustice. Running Wolf had come to check on the white woman who had traded fairly with his people. Sarah McClintock was one of the few whites who had shown his band respect rather than fear or hatred. When she had needed winter supplies, she had offered fair payment and spoken to them as equals, not as the savages most whites believed them to be. But now her small cabin sat empty, its windows dark and cold. No smoke rose from the chimney, no chickens pecked in the yard. The woman was gone, and Running Wolf's warrior instincts told him her disappearance was connected to the strange mood that had settled over the town. He had learned enough English from traders and missionaries to understand much of what the white people said, though he rarely let them know this. It was a useful skill. Men often revealed their true thoughts when they believed no one could understand them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of old blood, Running Wolf made his decision. He would enter the town under cover of darkness and discover what had happened to the woman who had shown his people kindness. Moving with the silent grace that had made him feared among his enemies, Running Wolf descended toward Cedar Falls. His moccasined feet made no sound on the rocky ground, and his buckskin clothing blended perfectly with the shadows. He was a ghost in the darkness. invisible to the white eyes that looked but did not truly see. The town was quieter than usual, but not with the peaceful quiet of sleep. This was the uneasy quiet of people who had done something they knew was wrong, but refused to admit it. Lights burned in most of the houses, and Running Wolf could hear the murmur of voices discussing the day's events. He paused outside the general store, where a group of men had gathered on the porch. Their words drifted clearly through the night air. Should have seen the look on her face when they put the lid on, one man was saying with a cruel laugh. Pure terror it was. Fitting end for a woman who forgot her place. Reverend did right by us, another voice agreed. Can't have our women thinking they can live like men, trading with savages and such. Sets a bad example. My wife's been acting more respectful since this morning, a third man added. Nothing like a good example to keep the women folk in line. Running Wolf's blood ran cold as the meaning of their words sank in. They had buried the woman alive. The white woman who had shown his people dignity and respect had been murdered by her own kind for the crime of treating Indians as human beings. Rage filled his chest like a prairie fire, but he forced himself to remain still and silent. A warrior's first duty was to gather information, not to act on emotion. He needed to know exactly what had happened and where they had taken her. Moving deeper into the town, Running Wolf approached the church where more voices could be heard. Through a window, he could see Reverend Carmichael holding court with several of the town's leading citizens, all of them drinking whiskey and congratulating themselves on their righteous actions. The Lord's work was done today, Carmichael was saying, his voice slurred with alcohol. We've cleansed our community of corruption and set an example that will be remembered for generations. Think she's dead yet? Deputy Brennan asked with morbid curiosity. Dead or dying, Carmichael replied callously. Either way, she'll never corrupt another soul. The earth will reclaim her, and our children will grow up in a purer world. Running Wolf's hands clenched into fists, his muscles tensing with the effort of restraining himself. These men spoke of murder, as if it were a holy act, of burying a woman alive as if it were justice. They were worse than the cruelest enemies he had ever faced in battle, but he still needed to know where they had taken her, if there was even the slightest chance that Sarah McClintock still lived. The cemetery. The men had mentioned the cemetery several times during their drunken celebration. Running Wolf turned and melted back into the shadows, moving swiftly toward the hill where the white people buried their dead. The cemetery was easy to find, a fenced area on a low hill overlooking the town, marked by wooden crosses and crude headstones. But as Running Wolf approached, he noticed something that made his heart race. One grave was obviously fresh, the dirt still loose and dark against the pale earth. He dropped to his knees beside the grave, pressing his ear to the ground. For a moment he heard nothing but the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Then, so faint he almost missed it, came the sound he had been hoping and praying for, the barely audible rhythm of a human heartbeat, muffled by earth and wood, but still present. She was alive, barely, but alive. Running Wolf began to dig with his bare hands, scooping away the loose dirt with desperate urgency. The earth was soft, recently disturbed, but there was so much of it. 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet deep. How far down had they buried her? His fingernails broke and bled as he clawed at the dirt, his powerful shoulders straining with effort. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool night air, and his breath came in harsh gasps. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Every second that passed was a second closer to the woman's death. Finally, his fingers struck wood. Running Wolf cleared the dirt away from the top of the crude coffin, revealing the hastily nailed lid. He could hear nothing from inside now. No heartbeat, no breathing, no sign of life. Had he arrived too late? Using his knife, Running Wolf pried at the nails holding the lid in place. The wood was green and soft, and the nails came free with harsh squeaks that seemed to echo across the cemetery. He threw the lid aside and looked down into the dark interior of the makeshift coffin. Sarah McClintock lay motionless, her face pale as death in the moonlight. Her hands were still bound behind her back, and her clothes were torn and dirty from her struggles. For a heart-stopping moment, Running Wolf thought she was dead. Then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest, so slight it was almost invisible. She was unconscious, starved for air, but still alive. Running Wolf reached down and lifted her carefully from the wooden box, cradling her against his chest as he would a wounded child. She was so light, so fragile, nothing like the strong, determined woman he had met during their trading encounters. The ordeal had nearly killed her. He carried her away from the grave, away from the cemetery, away from the town that had tried to murder her. In a sheltered grove of cottonwoods beside a small stream, he laid her gently on the soft grass and began the delicate work of trying to save her life. First, he cut the ropes binding her hands, cursing silently at the deep cuts the hemp had made in her wrists. Then he tilted her head back and breathed his own air into her lungs, trying to restore the oxygen her body desperately needed. "Live," he whispered in his own language, then repeated it in English. "You must live. Those who did this to you must not be allowed to win." For long minutes he worked over her still form, breathing for her, massaging her chest, willing her heart to keep beating. The stream babbled softly nearby, and an owl called mournfully from the darkness. Otherwise the night was silent, except for the sound of Running Wolf's desperate efforts to save a woman who had shown his people kindness when her own kind had shown her only cruelty. Finally, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She drew in a gasping breath, then another, her body convulsing as it remembered how to live, her wild, terrified gaze fixed on Running Wolf's face, and for a moment she seemed about to scream. "You are safe," Running Wolf said quietly in English, his voice gentle despite the rage that still burned in his chest. "The men who did this to you, they will not find you here." Sarah tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. I am Running Wolf of the Comanche. You traded with my people. You showed us respect when others would not. Now I return that respect." Tears began to flow down Sarah's dirt-stained cheeks as the reality of her rescue sank in. "They buried me alive," she whispered. "My own people. They buried me alive for trading with you." Running Wolf's jaw tightened with controlled fury. "Your people are not worthy of the name. What they did to you was the act of cowards and murderers." "They'll come looking for me," Sarah said, struggling to sit up. "When they discover I'm gone, they'll come with guns and ropes and—" "Let them come," Running Wolf said grimly. "I am not afraid of men who bury women alive. But first, we must get you far from here. You need food, water, warmth. You need to heal." As he helped her to her feet, Running Wolf made a silent vow. The woman who had shown his people dignity would be protected, no matter the cost. And someday, somehow, the men who had tried to murder her would face justice. Not the twisted justice of Cedar Falls, but the true justice of a warrior's blade. The night wind carried the scent of sage and freedom, and together they disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only an empty grave and the promise of reckoning to come. 3 weeks had passed since Running Wolf had pulled Sarah McClintock from her living grave, and the autumn winds now carried the first hint of winter's approach. In a hidden canyon 20 miles from Cedar Falls, Sarah had slowly regained her strength under the warrior's patient care. He had built her a shelter of branches and buffalo hide, brought her game to eat, and tended her wounds with the skill of someone who had seen too much violence in his lifetime. But both of them knew their sanctuary could not last forever. "They will come eventually," Sarah said, as she sat beside the small fire Running Wolf had built in a depression that would hide the smoke. Her voice was stronger now, though she still bore the haunted look of someone who had stared death in the face. "Brennan's not the type to give up easily, especially when his reputation is at stake." Running Wolf nodded grimly as he sharpened his knife on a smooth stone. "Let them come, but they will not find us unprepared." Sarah studied his weathered face in the firelight. Over the past weeks, she had learned that Running Wolf was not just a warrior, but a man of deep intelligence and surprising gentleness. He had risked everything to save her, and she knew she owed him a debt that could never be repaid. "Why did you do it?" she asked quietly. "You could have let me die and avoided all this trouble. Your people, they must think you've lost your mind, protecting a white woman." Running Wolf was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "My grandmother once told me that the Great Spirit judges us, not by the color of our skin, but by the courage in our hearts. You showed courage when you treated my people with respect. You showed honor when others showed hatred. Such a person deserves to live, regardless of what others believe." Before Sarah could respond, Running Wolf held up his hand, his body tensing like a wolf scenting danger. "Riders," he whispered. "Many of them." Sarah's blood ran cold as the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. They had been found. Running Wolf quickly scattered the fire and helped Sarah to her feet. "There is another way out of this canyon," he said urgently. "A narrow path that leads to the mesa top, but it is dangerous in the darkness." "More dangerous than staying here?" Sarah asked. The hoofbeats were getting closer now, and Sarah could hear voices calling through the night. She recognized Deputy Brennan's harsh tone and the pompous cadence of Reverend Carmichael's voice. "Come now," Running Wolf said. leading her toward a barely visible break in the canyon wall. But as they reached the narrow path, torches appeared at the canyon mouth. A dozen riders spread out across the entrance, their weapons gleaming in the flickering light. There was no escape. "Sarah McClintock!" Brennan's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "We know you're in there, and we know that savage is with you. Come out now, and we might be merciful." Running Wolf's hand moved to the war hatchet at his belt. "Stay behind me," he told Sarah. "Whatever happens, do not let them take you alive. They have already shown what their mercy is worth." "Running Wolf," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, this is all my fault." "No," he said firmly. "This is the fault of men who have forgotten how to be human. You have nothing to apologize for." The riders moved deeper into the canyon, their torches casting wild shadows on the rock walls. Reverend Carmichael rode in the center of the group, his black coat making him look like a carrion bird in the dancing light. "You cannot hide forever," Carmichael called out. "Come forth and face the justice you have so long avoided." "Justice!" Sarah stepped out from behind Running Wolf, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "You speak of justice after you buried me alive for the crime of treating human beings with dignity." Carmichael's eyes glittered with fanatic fervor. "You consorted with our enemies, woman. You betrayed everything decent and holy." "I traded fairly with peaceful men," Sarah replied, her fear transforming into righteous anger. "While you and your followers have committed murder in the name of God." "Murder?" Brennan laughed harshly. "We were cleansing our community of corruption, and now we'll finish the job." Running Wolf stepped forward, his war hatchet gleaming in the torchlight. "You will have to go through me first," he said quietly. The two groups faced each other across the narrow canyon floor, one man and one woman against a dozen armed riders. The odds were hopeless, but Running Wolf showed no fear, and Sarah drew strength from his courage. "One savage against all of us," Old Pete called out with cruel laughter. This should be entertaining, but before anyone could make a move, new sounds echoed through the canyon, the thunder of many hooves and the war cries of Comanche warriors. Running Wolf had not been as alone as he had seemed. A dozen painted warriors appeared on the canyon rim, their rifles trained on the men below. More emerged from hidden positions among the rocks, surrounding Brennan's posse with deadly efficiency. "It seems," Running Wolf said with grim satisfaction, "that I am not the only one who values justice." Brennan's hand moved toward his gun, but froze as a rifle shot cracked through the air, the bullet striking the ground inches from his horse's hooves. "I would not," said a new voice from the canyon rim. An older Comanche warrior, his face marked with the scars of many battles, looked down at the trapped white men with cold contempt. "My son has told me what you did to this woman. Now you will face true justice." Carmichael's face had gone white with terror, but his voice still carried its usual arrogance. "You have no authority here, savage. This is a matter between civilized people." The old warrior, whom Sarah now realized must be Running Wolf's father, laughed harshly. "Civilized? You bury women alive and call it civilized? You murder the innocent and call it justice? You are less than animals." "What do you want?" Brennan asked, his voice shaking. "First," Running Wolf said, stepping forward, "you will confess your crimes, all of you. You will admit what you did to this woman and why." "Never," Carmichael snarled. "I'll not confess to doing God's work." Another rifle shot rang out, this one close enough to singe the Reverend's coat. He yelped and nearly fell from his horse. "You will confess," Running Wolf repeated calmly, "or you will die here. The choice is yours." One by one, faced with certain death, the men began to speak. They confessed to burying Sarah alive, to their twisted reasoning, to their cruel pleasure in her suffering. Each word was like a knife twisting in Sarah's heart, but she forced herself to listen. These men needed to face the truth of what they had done. When the last confession had been wrung from them, Running Wolf's father spoke again. "Now you will return to your town and tell everyone what you have admitted here. You will tell them that Sarah McClintock was innocent of any crime, save showing kindness to people you considered beneath you." "And if we refuse?" Brennan asked. The old warrior's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then you will not return to your town at all." "They'll never believe us," Old Pete protested. "They'll say we were forced to lie." "Perhaps," Running Wolf said, "but the seed of doubt will be planted, and doubt once planted has a way of growing." As the first light of dawn began to creep over the canyon rim, the men of Cedar Falls were allowed to ride away. They looked back only once, seeing Sarah standing beside Running Wolf, alive and defiant, despite all their efforts to destroy her. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as the sound of hoofbeats faded in the distance. "Now," Running Wolf said. You choose. You can try to return to the white world, though I do not think you will find welcome there. Or you can come with us. My people will accept you, as you accepted us. You have proven your worth through suffering, and that is something we understand. Sarah looked back toward the distant town of Cedar Falls, then at the Comanche warriors who had risked their lives to save her. The choice was easier than she had expected. I've seen enough of so-called civilization, she said quietly. Perhaps it's time I learned what true honor looks like. As they rode out of the canyon together, Sarah McClintock left behind more than just the town that had tried to murder her. She left behind a world that valued conformity over courage, prejudice over justice, and fear over understanding. The winter winds carried news back to Cedar Falls of a white woman who rode with the Comanche, who had been dead but lived again, who had found more humanity among savages than she had ever known among her own kind. Some said it was impossible, others claimed it was divine judgment. But Reverend Carmichael never preached another sermon about the natural order or the righteousness of their actions. And in the years that followed, more than one person in Cedar Falls would wake in the dark hours before dawn, remembering the sound of dirt falling on wood and wondering if they had buried their own souls along with Sarah McClintock. The graves of the wicked, they learned, were not always as permanent as they believed, and sometimes the dead returned to remind the living of the difference between justice and vengeance, between civilization and cruelty, between the courage to show mercy and the cowardice to hide behind righteous words. In the end, Sarah McClintock had found her true family among people who understood that honor was not determined by the color of one's skin, but by the choices one made when faced with the darkness in human hearts. And Running Wolf had proven that sometimes the greatest act of civilization was to save someone from the civilized world itself.